Hello and welcome. My name is Owen Redwood, and this is the very first lecture of the Offensive Computer Security Open Courseware. This is the 2015 version, and it is hosted at hackallthethings.com. This class is a structured, hands-on survey of topics that have been hand-picked across the fields of exploit development, vulnerability research, web application hacking, and network hacking, forensics, and so on. It's very hands-on with the homework assignments and will transform absolute noobs into ninjas in about 16 weeks. That is, if you do all the work and get a decent grade. Towards that, every student is required to find a zero-day vulnerability, specifically an exploitable memory corruption bug, and this is the breakdown of the schedule. It is supposed to go on for 15 weeks of lectures, with 2 lectures a week. There's approximately 10 homeworks in the course, and 2 exams, midterms, and a final exam. The prerequisites for the course are designed to be very newbie friendly. All you need to have under your belt before this course is some familiarity with C and C++, some familiarity with assembly, hopefully x86, and a basic grasp of security concepts. Originally, I created this from scratch at Florida State University while I was doing my PhD. It was first taught in 2013, titled Offensive Security, and the links are provided. It was renamed to Offensive Computer Security in 2014, and is still taught at FSU, now currently by Professor Zhuwen Liu, who was the advisor for the class in the 2013 and 2014 periods. Since its inception, the OCS courseware has spread to over a dozen universities. Sometimes it's taught by faculty, most of the time it's taught by fellow students and their security clubs and CTF teams, usually outside of their own class schedule. This time, I've spent a lot of effort putting way better exercise in the homeworks, polishing up all the lecture videos and slides, adding in also new content such as Windows internals, more ROP content, and more on hunting VLC ODAs and fuzzing. It's all still open source, and we are happy to help other universities with it, as well as other forms of curriculum development. This is me. I go by the name Owen. My handle is Scald. I have some degrees, and I've done some neat stuff. My focuses really are bug hunting, vulnerability research, reverse engineering, general offense and defense, especially related to embedded systems and cyber-physical systems. I also have interests in botnet design and analysis, reverse engineering, honeypots, and etc. Hana is a co-instructor of the course. She is teaching the reverse engineering sections and is a good friend of mine. She has worked across several private industry companies in the U.S. government in the last 9 years. She is an expert in information system security, vulnerability research, and computer network operations. She enjoys CTFs and has competed in a DEF CON CTF final round at DEF CON in 2014. The website for this course is hosted at hackallthethings.com. It is designed to be self-paced, such that if you do 2 lectures a week and follow the homework schedule over 15 weeks, you should be able to complete it all. It should typically require 3 hours a week to get through the lectures and 5 hours at most outside of that per week towards the homeworks for your time investment. This is a not chronologically ordered breakdown of just how many lectures we dedicate to each topic. The beginning topics of C and C++, bugs and code auditing, as well as Linux and Windows operating system internals, fundamentals, and how rootkits work on them, take collectively 6 lectures. After that, we dive into the real content of the course, starting with reverse engineering. We have 2 lectures on that. 2 lectures on general bug hunting with static and dynamic analysis techniques and fuzzing, and then we have 7 lectures on exploit development that are somewhat spread throughout the course. There may be more than that at the end of the course, depending on how much bonus content we create and release. There are 4 lectures currently planned for web application hacking, 3 currently planned for network hacking, 1 for memory forensics and incident response. However, it is certainly a theme throughout the majority of other lectures. And finally, we have 2 final lectures on social engineering and physical security, because meat space security, as I say, is just as important as cyberspace security. This is the grade breakdown for the work of this course. Homeworks take up 55% of the class grade. Midterms each take 15%, and the final exam takes 15% as well. It's designed to be individual work only for all the homeworks, assignments, as well as the VLC fuzzing, and the grading is solely based off your ability to utilize the required skills of the course that are taught, as well as to communicate what you did, what happened, and etc. For this class, instructors or students should plan on having midterm 1 at approximately week 6. Midterm 2 should be approximately around week 13. And the final exam will be at the end, week 15 or 16, depending on how it gets spread out. Extra credit for the course should be granted for any participation in Capture the Flag games. You can see the website ctftime.org to see a schedule of every upcoming CTF around the world. There's pretty much one every week, if not every other week, in any given semester. And if your university has a CTF team or a cybersecurity club, they are a great place for a student to get involved with such a competition. Now, for instructors, weighing the student's solution or contribution to a CTF team should be twofold: how much they contributed to that solution, and also the amount of points assigned to that problem. Typically, CTF problems are scaled on a classic Jeopardy board with exploitation for 100, 200, 300, all the way up to 500, sometimes higher. Typically, they are pretty consistent across different CTFs in terms of the point distribution per difficulty. So 500 point problems should always receive some serious extra credit. So if you've got this far and you're worried you perhaps don't satisfy the prerequisites of having some familiarity with C, some familiarity with assembly, and a basic grasp of security concepts, you should definitely check out the free book Programming from the Ground Up. It's at the below link. It is a completely open source book. It starts off with the basics of computer architecture, teaches assembly, registers, how the processor works, how the instruction cycle works, how C works, and everything in between. It is a phenomenally good book, and it is just great that it is free. Once you've picked that up, picking up the rest of the basic security concepts to start this class should be a breeze. In fact, you could probably just jump straight from finishing this book into this course. This class has been designed for anyone who wants to become a better defender, incident responder, or for the offensive side, penetration tester. Just every security professional, forensics professional, and vulnerability research in general should go through this course, at least if they're not familiar with the contents covered within. And that being said, we mainly focus very heavily on vulnerability research and penetration testing in that order. This class is not for people who are completely new to InfoSec, C, assembly, and etc. You will fail this class. Lazy people who do not do the assigned homework at the very least will fail. I've designed it so a lot of the reading is no longer necessary. It's been pushed into the slides, but it's definitely still very useful, the reading that's highlighted for each lecture. Tests will cover They used to cover material that was only in the books. Now we've pushed that into lecture 2. So that everything on the exam is stuff that's from the lectures. The textbooks for this course are first, Hacking the Art of Exploitation, the second edition by John Erickson. I often refer to it as the AOE. It's a 2008 book. It's a very hands-on approach, and it has a live CD that we use for some of the demos. It is going to be our main textbook. Our secondary textbook is the Web Application Hacker's Handbook, also the second edition by David Studard. It's a 2012 book, and we use it in the second half of the class. You should, going into this class, already know how to use virtual machines. The live CD that comes with the AOE book is ideal for experimentation, and you can download the ISO from the publisher's website. This is a, at this point, incomplete list of all of the books that I have gone through to create this class. And this is probably only half of them. Notable mentions are the Shellcoder's Handbook, Practical Malware Analysis, the Rootkit Arsenal, Secure Coding, and C and C++ is a must for anyone wanting to do secure development, and so on. There are many motivations for teaching this course, as well as offensive material in a security curriculum. Teaching only defense to students is like teaching blind people to be architects. They will be unable to see weaknesses, faults, and vulnerabilities in the design of an application or a system. They will not have the analytical skills to be able to assess the effectiveness or validity of any given of general security mechanisms, and ultimately, in the general case, things will just feel secure, but then not be able to actually assess whether or not they are secure. Offense, however, analyzes the effectiveness in a very binary matter. Either the attack works or it doesn't. Furthermore, many security curriculums that I've seen focus very heavily on cryptography. However, in my experience of exploitation and hacking, I've never really had to deal with a crypto system. Never had to break any encrypted cipher or do any decryption to get to the target. Modern binary exploitation usually doesn't require dealing with any of that. And a good quote I like to cite is from Matt Blaze, who's a renowned cryptographer, and is that one of the most dangerous aspects of cryptology is that you can almost measure it. Ultimately, everything is proven to be secure up to a point. It is relying on assumed difficult problems such as the discrete log problem or big number factorization, and these problems are really only measured by the test of time. Finally, another good motivation is that a fool with a tool is still a fool, which is a problem that plagues the penetration testing industry, as the majority of pen testers are simply just script kiddies with glorified tools. Too many pen tests simply go like this. A pen tester uses a script utility on the target, and it reports there are no ways in. The pen tester then tells the client, "You are safe," and the client pretty much gets hacked a week later. And it's a big mistake to think that simple tools and scripts are sufficient for doing vulnerability assessment and penetration testing, and that is why this class teaches all the fundamentals and essential knowledge and is designed to be agnostic of all of the tools. Another very important problem that is just simply growing is the cost of reactive security, of only teaching defense, is that the number of records being leaked per year by attackers targeting systems is just growing out of control. In 2013, it was almost 1 billion records leaked, at about 800 million, which is over twice the size of the population of the United States. In 2014, just last year, it was over 1 billion, and it's probably already over that at this point in 2015. And there are multiple ways that attackers are getting into systems to leak these records, and they involve binary exploitation, cross-site scripting. SQL injection is probably the biggest one. Um, Bypassing weak authentication or poor session management systems, and etc. There are many categories, and we're going to touch on all the big ones. Another motivation is that getting into the offensive side of the security industry is a lot of fun. You get paid to hack and to think like a bad guy, and people think you are a ninja. And if you're good, you deserve that title. Many don't. Doesn't mean they can't earn it. Networks are getting hacked all the time now. You pretty much can't go a week without hearing about a big company getting hacked, and because of that, incident responders are in high demand, especially ones that understand offense well. These are just stories from 2012, but everyone from the CIA's websites to Sony, which has got hacked multiple times, to social security databases and medical records, and insurance companies and banks are getting hacked, and these heist numbers on the amount of millions being stolen are only increasing in recent years, especially in the past 3 years since these headlines. And because of that, well, people are investing heavily in people who understand all of this material. So let's get into it. This class is about two high-level topics: security assessment and risk assessment. Risk assessment is pretty much some vague function of the threats you have against the vulnerabilities that you have. Essentially, it's a understanding or measure of the likelihood of your given threats attacking or exploiting the potential vulnerabilities that you have, as well as the resulting impact that that may have on your organization. Security is a lot like this picture. They call you crazy if you practice and invest in a lot of it, and unfortunately it's really only appreciated when the threats are visible and stopped. If you invest a lot in security and you still get hacked, obviously you look bad. It's one of those things that never gets really good press, and therefore is never incentivized properly. And in reality, security employees will only really see negative press. Attacks only make them look bad. Good security does not get noticed. It is often actually instead inconvenient. It gets noticed by developers who complain about new restrictions, new policies, and etc. And it will often block development work and projects because of that. And so this leads it to being largely reactive. And if then the objective of the security employee is simply to respond to attacks and manage the attack surface without any proactive authority or abilities, then it's essentially sabotage from the start, because of the ever expanding attack surface as organizations grow, as they add more services, expand their businesses, and diversify what they're doing. Whereas security should be made more proactive in order to be effective. Security employees should be allowed to go out and look for problems. They should be allowed to engage in some amount of red teaming and penetration testing, vulnerability assessment. At the very least, have code review and code auditing. And it's always very helpful to have a weekly meeting where you share developments on security news like NetSec and blogs and other subreddits, and all of these activities should be encouraged and incentivized because it's 2015, everyone's getting hacked left and right, and proactive security is absolutely the way to do things properly. That in part means offensive security. There are a number of useful websites that can be used to show laymen the scope and scale of attacks going on 24/7. One such website is the Digital Attack Map. It is used to show off the global DDoS traffic, which comes from either botnets or amplification attacks and so on. When it knows the source and destination, it will list it, and you can display all this information by mousing over it. At the bottom, you can click on recent events that have been logged or highlighted by the site's curators to display interesting phenomenon or attacks. Here, this is reasonably a light day for DDoS traffic. Come on, load. Okay, it's loaded. This is an interesting attack hitting the Philippines from around the world. Typically, when it's unknown, it's distributed very evenly, such that it can't be attributed to a single country. However, there's also some other interesting attacks going on from China to Canada, somewhere in Canada, and they're hitting it with 63 gigabytes per second down. But I encourage you to visit this site and play around with it, check out some interesting attacks. And let's get back to the lecture. So this is all just DDoS, and I don't really consider it hacking. It's just denial of service, not actually gaining access to a target system. It's instead just overwhelming it. So in this class, we spent a lot of time thoroughly exploring the art of exploitation, the art of gaining unauthorized access, primarily so that we can recognize when it is happening, so that we can prevent it, and design systems such that it is defended against. Penetration testing and incident response both require a great deal of offensive knowledge. Some educators consider this all dark arts and they should never be taught, but in reality, they are analytical tools. They're analytical skills, and by applying them, you can proactively engage in security. But if all you do is respond to attack after attack and never do anything proactively, then all you're doing is reactive security. And so you might be wondering, what's the difference between hacking, cracking, penetration testing, red teaming, security assessment, etc.? Well, the difference between illegal hacking and legal hacking is one word: permission. This is on the exam. It's this simple. If you do not have permission to engage in hacking activities on a target system, it is illegal. If you have permission, then it may be legal as long as the permission is from the owner and or administrator of that system, then they're authorized to give such permission. Sometimes the owner or administrator is not authorized. It depends on the network, and so that's why I say may. But permission is the single distinguishing factor between legal and illegal hacking. It's not certifications, it's not ethicalness, it's not this cert or that cert, it's permission. So let's talk about vulnerabilities and how the history of vulnerability disclosure and hacking has played out over the years. This graph is quite interesting. It can be interpreted a number of different ways. One might interpret it as, over time, we've been actually getting worse and having more and more vulnerabilities in our code. Another way to interpret it is that situational awareness is getting better. In fact, we're more and more aware of these vulnerabilities. In fact, we're discovering new ones, and we're getting better at looking into the code and finding them and disclosing them. It does stabilize at some point around 2008 to currently, and this is, however, just for enterprise systems, browsers, desktop systems, excluding embedded systems, routers, critical infrastructure, and mobile, Android, iPhone, etc. systems. This next graph shows vulnerability disclosures by large enterprise software vendors. The top 10 vendors have had a steady share of the disclosed vulnerabilities in the marketplace over the 2013 and 2014 period. And the remaining, share of the market doesn't get as much focus. It doesn't mean that they're that much crappier, the top 10 at code. It means that people pay attention to them that much more because of their market share. In general, I found that there's kind of a uniform, even distribution of vulnerabilities in code as long as it's sufficiently large, and it doesn't matter whether or not it's popular, unpopular, or etc. Now, for vulnerability severity, there's a scoring metric, which we will cover later on when we discuss C and C++ vulnerabilities in the next lectures. It has 10 being the worst and 0 being the least severe, or the best case in terms of a vulnerability, and that it will have very limited adverse effects. And over the past 2-3 years, it has kept kind of a steady distribution that only 1% of all the disclosed vulnerabilities are actually severe ones. 28 to 23% are high severity that still have a significant adverse effect if they're exploited, and the remaining 2/3 typically have a moderate adverse effect if they're exploited. The the low range has grown a little bit, but not significantly. The majority, however, of vulnerabilities across the years at least have a moderate adverse effect or impact if they are exploited. Mobile has been following a similar trend. It is newer, so it may be plateauing out. This graph does not have data on 2014 or 2015 yet, so it's still too soon to tell how this trend will play out. But it is obviously increasing in the total vulnerabilities being disclosed. As for SCADA, which is a nightmare of a field for security, the vulnerabilities are, by almost everyone's measures, increasing per year. And this breaks it down by the repository or database in which the disclosures are held. The National Vulnerability Database, NVD, is a big one. Secunia is another big one. OSVDB is also a big one. It has a lot more, obviously, especially for SCADA. Actually, the OSVDB, which stands for Open Source Vulnerability Database, is my favorite. Its motto is "Everything is vulnerable," which I agree with, and it has not only good blog posts and good opinion pieces, but its database is quite thorough and well constructed. But that's a topic for another time. So, to break it down, vulnerability disclosure grew rapidly from 1996 through 2006. And in my research, this closely corresponds with the kind of evolution of security awareness. In fact, 2006 and prior to that was a era marked by discoveries of new categories of vulnerabilities that were previously unknown. It wasn't thought that these could be exploited in a malicious way. And past that, there have been fewer kind of new categories that have come out in terms of vulnerabilities, and it's kind of stabilized. However, in 2014, last year, CERT-CC was launched, and they started collecting vulnerabilities on all platforms, including Android, and all of the Android vulnerabilities that got dumped into this database bumped this number up significantly higher, up by 20 plus K for disclosures in 2014. And the previous graph shown here didn't go up to 2014, so it's not reflected in this slide. Hopefully, this in 2015 stabilizes and returns back to this stable growth, as opposed to the rapid growth that we've seen in the 1996 to 2006 era. So, for post-exploitation trends, these are the consequences of exploitation. An attacker will gain one of the following, and this is broken down over thousands of incident response reports compiled by IBM's X-Force Research and Development team. The obvious one should be that the attackers gained access in an unauthorized manner to a target system, but a secondary or another impact has also been observed that it's been popular for attackers to attack other users once inside the network with cross-site scripting attacks, denial of service attacks, to try and obtain other information like phishing, to try and use credentials or weaknesses discovered thereafter of the initial exploitation to bypass security, to gain privileges, maybe on the local system by privilege escalation, or to use the credentials found on that target system to try and log into another system across the network, perhaps lateral, or if that user is an admin on another box, it would be vertical movement and privileges across the network, data manipulation and sabotage, and etc. But ultimately, at the end of the day, the big ticket item that gets the most news and causes the most damage is the unauthorized access of information, especially in databases. For 2015, the U.S. government's Office of Personnel Management hack was the largest on record, with 6+ million records leaked, and they had no encryption. They had terrible database administrators that had root access in different countries. Apparently, they were outsourcing that. It seemed like a good idea, and having all of the sensitive access information in these databases just stored in clear text without cryptography or hashing. All of the passwords were in clear text as well, and they didn't follow any of the government standards that they dictated to the private sector. But I digress. Prior to that, we've witnessed epic and insane growth in the total number of records being leaked per year in cyber attacks, to the point where we've, in just the last year, already surpassed 1 billion records leaked. And this is nearing the population of India and China being leaked per year. This goes to show that it is statistically likely that at some point in your life, your records, if you've done any business online, ever been to a hospital, even gone to just a store in person, that's all getting digitized and stored in a database, even at the local store, and probably getting pushed up to some corporate store or HQ at some point. Your records will likely be exposed in a breach, and there's nothing that you can do to prevent it. You can stay completely off the internet, and it will not protect you from identity theft. This problem is so epic that it is really causing massive problems across the industry, such that there was a recent Supreme Court ruling that now has enabled and authorized the FCC to sue companies that are getting hacked, to fine them for such massive leaks, because these ultimately, all of the costs are ultimately getting passed on to the consumer at this point. Sure, the vendors or the targets pay for like a year of identity theft protection, but that does not stop the identity thieves at all. Especially when it takes them 6 months to roll it out to the victims. There's a very compelling number that has been estimated for the cost per record of each leaked record, and in 2013 is estimated at $136. I believe that was bumped up to 140, 150 per record in 2015 this year, and this is estimated by the Ponemon. I want to say Pokemon, but the Ponemon Institute, and that's a study also sponsored by IBM X-Force Research. This is a very compelling metric because now you can multiply this by the number of records that you have in your database to estimate the potential cost of a data breach and use this to argue for whatever budgetary needs you need in order to prevent your company from going out of business, especially under new upcoming laws that will heavily fine you should you get breached. And these laws will likely spread to other parts of the world and to other countries, so it's still very relevant for everyone watching this. So all of these graphs, or at least some of the beginning graphs, keep showing us getting worse, especially in mobile and SCADA. There's more vulnerabilities being disclosed every year, and as I said, that's one way to interpret that graph. However, another way to interpret it is that we are getting better at catching bugs and reporting them even 5, 10, 15 years ago, and technology has certainly scaled much differently now as opposed to 15 years ago, and the targets are much more numerous. It's a rich field as opposed to when these started in 1996. So, say you find a vulnerability or a security bug or problem, and you want to disclose it. Many people don't know how to go about doing that. Who do you tell? Do you tell the developers behind the project? Do you tell their lawyer? Do you tell your lawyer first? How do you tell them? What do you tell them? Do you tell them the steps you went about finding it? You might put a foot in your mouth and tell them something incorrect or something that might get you in trouble because you don't know how they're going to react. How would they react to you telling them that you found something wrong with their product? Especially if it turns out to be a severe vulnerability as opposed to a minor one. If it's a severe one, would they sue you? What is the cost of fixing it? Is it going to cost them a nationwide recall of a product? Is the cost of patching it going to be prohibitive? Maybe they may just conclude that they should ignore it, which is actually, unfortunately, still very common for vendors to do. What if you worked really hard to find it? Like, you worked for 6 months. Should your time be compensated? You caught something that their developers and their teams that are being paid a salary did not catch. Perhaps this bug that you're turning in actually will save their business because if someone found out about it and exploited it, they could leak all of these records and sink that company. On the other hand, what if they realize this and then decide to silence you and threaten legal action and cease and desist you? What if they, again, ignore everything and do nothing? Who should you tell then? It's a very complicated reality and problem. Because still, in 2015, companies are doing all of these things. And there's good companies and bad companies at this, but there's also good researchers and bad researchers that are disclosing these things in hostile or offensive ways to vendors. So it's easy to engage in what is called the disclosure debate and see a variety of different opinions in a given crowd. And so let's talk about how we got here and dive into the disclosure debate. Dust off your coconuts, because early on we had security mailing lists and FRAC is still around now. It's very attacker focused, and back in 1985 people really didn't know about security, didn't think it was a problem, didn't think that you could just connect to another computer and make it do malicious things. And people doing security research were and discovering these vulnerabilities must have very malicious intentions if they're poking around on the system and trying to find these bugs in the first place. And they must be evil people practicing very dark magic, and they should be locked up and hunted. Um, but in 1988, the Morris worm hit the internet at the time and really woke people up that, hey, you can do really malicious things and cause a lot of damage. Um, and so, in response to that, a lot of people put together security mailing lists. Some of these disclosing bugs and patches and workarounds and strategies, and these were invite only. And the main problem is that in this time, the vendors really would not acknowledge security problems, and everything back then was buy at your own risk. But only the attackers actually knew the risks, and the people in these mailing lists knew the risks. And these mailing lists, they're nice in concept, but the second an attacker gets invited to one, then the concept fails. The attacker is then let in on all the secrets or any of the secret sauce, and they now have a privileged inside perspective on how people are setting things up, so they can curtail and tailor their attacks specifically to defeat these defenses. This all changed. Full disclosure came about and set a really interesting precedent. Um, Originally, it's kind of attributed to the eight-legged groove machine, which was a kind of a bug report site that established a basic format that remains today. It identifies the affected software, operating system, the version, description of the impact, the potential fix and workaround, and whether or not it's been reported to the public, and the time, the vendor and the public, and any timelines. And it was extremely controversial at the time, but it was, in retrospect, I feel it was absolutely necessary because the vendors were not paying attention at all. None of them were, it seems. And so, in a sense, it was necessary because it woke everyone up. This is an example of eight-legged groove machine full disclosure report. It reports the vulnerable programs, the platforms it is present on, and describes as a kind of a local and remote root exploit. In that syslog is used to log both local and remote activity, like network traffic, and it doesn't perform any bounds checking. And this can be exploited. And even early on, they were writing example proof of concept exploits to overwrite buffer overflow of this vulnerability using just sendmail. And but at the time, they realized that if this got out, it would crash every single Sun OS. It would allow the attack of every Sun OS web server or server running sendmail due to the severity of the bug. And even early on, in 1995, they realized that just by disclosing this much information, it would be enough to supply the black hats with enough information to just rediscover on their own and weaponize an exploit against this vulnerability. But this was all very kind of underground at that time. Sun, the vendors, they did not pay attention to these kind of community disclosure sites. And so when people called Sun and inquired about the vulnerabilities, they didn't accept the advisory as a problem and couldn't prove that it exists in their own systems. And they're just were not on the ball. They had no system to keep track of these as they came up. And What came about was kind of a versioning and identification system for these bugs and vulnerabilities, such that they were identified by a unique string. That way, the communication both externally and internally of a vendor could be more efficient about the status of vulnerabilities as they're coming out and getting patched. So the poor communication led to confusion and panic in customers. It really got the lawyers involved, and they tried suing and shutting down these sites. And the patching started, but it was slow, and the solutions were slow, and attackers could, at that time, exploit the reported bug way faster than it could be patched. And this actually still happens today. And this is absolutely a problem at small companies and startups that don't have a security team or a development team that is ready to handle security bug requests. And this is a example of a timeline for 0-day attacks for Java. Well, they get released in a advisory released by Java, and less than a day later, a security researcher has reverse engineered the patch and has built a proof of concept to exploit the vulnerability described in the security advisory. And typically, they found in less than 30 days, you'll see a weaponized version of this bug, or a weaponized exploit rather, added to the latest CrimeKit module, which has a number of exploits. And yeah, this is from IBM X-Force, and this was for CVE 2012-1723 for Java. And there's so many Java O days that just haven't been reported. So many. And so, for a while, full disclosure continued. The main problems with it is that it creates a problem to force vendors to act. Secondly, there was a great lack of clarity around the vulnerability research and the legal issues that involved it. The vendor's reaction usually was to first get the lawyers involved, and the laws at the time were simply just unclear. Third, the underground industry evolved around all of the new information available about vulnerabilities and etc. And mass malware arose from all the full disclosures, and the script kiddies got more weapons to toy with. The bottom lines essentially were that researchers often did it to become famous. Look at this new target that I cracked, was a kind of rationale at the time. And secondly, as far as research can show, full disclosure did not actually result in a reduction of attacks, but it did result in an increase in vendor response. Responsible disclosure came about in around 2002, and all of the mass malware and worms that came out as a consequence of full disclosure kind of woke people up. There's a lot of them. The I Love You worm, Code Red 2, Nimda, Blaster, Slammer, and etc. And most worms actually just copy-pasted the full disclosure researcher's code. And so in 2002, Chrisley and Wisopal submitted a procedure, kind of a paper, titled Responsible Vulnerability Disclosure Process, the IETF. And it argued that researchers can disclose it to the vendor and then withhold until the vendor patches. And this puts the responsibility squarely, unfortunately, on the researcher, not the vendor, because it put no obligation for the vendors to respond to any number of vulnerabilities. And so the researchers did all this work and again still saw that vendors resorted to their old ways of ignoring bug reports. However, in recent history, bug bounties came about around 2010, and people came to realize that vulnerability research is actually a valuable service that protects both the vendors and the customers, and that it should be rewarded, if not just incentivized. And so it kind of came along from something that was dubbed Linus's Law, after Linus Torvalds, the inventor of maintainer of the Linux kernel, and is that given enough eyeballs, all bugs are shallow. Which may be true in all cases, but not necessarily. And thus bug bounties were formed. So turn in your bugs and get money from the vendor for your hard work. And so as of 2013, Google will pay out up to $20,000, but I don't think they've actually ever done that. All of my experience is that they try to incredibly lowball people. Facebook, I've seen the worst of. Yahoo too. Let's see. Mozilla's pretty good. Others are pretty good. ZDI is a popular one. I think their payout has gone higher. Let's see. And there's, since 2013, a lot more. And the bug bounties have gone far up. In fact, here's a list. Weird domain computer security with ethical hacking. Blogspot.com. Anyways, that has a comprehensive list of bug bounty programs. Here's a timeline to summarize what we've gone over so far in terms of the vulnerability disclosure debate, from no disclosure to private emailing lists, full disclosure, responsible disclosure, and bug bounties. Now, in recent years, there's been an addition in coordinated disclosure, but I believe that's coming up soon. But at that time, as of 2013, the research has shown that vendors' patching trends got a lot better, and that 58% of bugs were being patched the same day across the industry, which is superb compared to the old days. But that's just for the ones that are getting patched. There's still, even in 2013, 2 years ago, 26% of all bugs across the field are just going, at least vulnerabilities, just going completely ignored. And this, I'll admit, this is a hard metric to research. So this is kind of an iceberg diagram that only shows the tip of the problem, because there are not many ways one can find out about what was reported to the vendor and hasn't been released since, unless it's being reported through CERT, which I don't believe the majority of bugs are. The majority go through the vendor first or some other third party. And so this is just an iceberg perspective, only seeing the tip of a much larger problem. Though it's getting good, it's still not good in other areas. Mobile is terrible, and this year at DEF CON there was a remote code execution exploit and a series of vulnerabilities released in lib stagefright, and the researchers disclosed it to Google and then did full disclosure 3 days later, arguing that that was enough time to fix it, which is laughable. But in the same, essentially, announcement, they said the only way to defend yourself is to buy our service, which is kind of highway robbery. SCADA and Embedded are also very poor for responding to vulnerability disclosures. And the graph on the right is the Cordova vulnerability that affected Android systems, and it tracks the timeline of the vendor response as well as the customer's implementation of the patch. And even in February of 2015 this year, over 60, about 50-60% of devices were still vulnerable to the Cordova attack, which is still terrible. That's because of many reasons. Um, Smartphones are kind of locked down to the security patching schedule of the carrier. So if it's T-Mobile or AT&T or etc., you only get the patches that are released for your phone by that vendor. And if your vendor, or sorry, that by that carrier, if your carrier doesn't care about your phone line anymore or isn't trying to sell it, and they've moved on to the newer model, you likely won't be receiving any more updates. In the end, more researchers lately do coordinated and responsible disclosure. And as a result, the number of true exploit disclosures, as in just full disclosure with the proof of concept exploit, has continued to drop from 2009 to 2013, and there's been about a 50% decrease over the 5-year span there. And that's because bugs are being more ethically disclosed and there's better patching. Um, and people, at least the researchers, aren't going about disclosing fully weaponized bugs, at least as much as they did back then. In my opinion, things are getting better because situational awareness is getting better. It was a problem prior to our current situational awareness that we simply just did not have the perspective or awareness of. So to recap, there's all different stances people can have. They can be against disclosing any bugs, full disclosure, responsible disclosure, coordinated disclosure, delayed disclosure, and etc. There is always going to be examples of how not to do disclosure and how to handle disclosure. This is a rage blog by Oracle's chief security officer complaining that security researchers have to break Oracle's license and end user agreement in order to find their vulnerabilities, which in many cases is actually false. And she argues that they find the majority of vulnerabilities in-house and they don't want to incentivize anyone looking for more on the outside. While that's fine, it's actually, from what I've seen, false. There are hordes of Oracle ODAs out there, and they are trivial to find. So she goes on in this blog to, if you read it as if it were typed in all caps, it would translate to how she's actually trying to tell you what she's meaning. She's saying stop breaking the license and the end user agreement, pretty much every other sentence, and saying that they will not give any credit to security researchers, even when they find a good vulnerability, and they'll simply just hit them with a stop breaking our license reply, and then they'll go off and patch it without giving them credit. And she goes on about a bunch of other topics, and her argument is utterly unconvincing. But it gives a lot of insight into how this company handles security research, both internally and externally. And I propose it as one of the bad examples, in my opinion. Now, there's another bad example from the security researcher side of July 2013. There's an Apple developer website that took user authentication in the get field as a extension of the URL, and by tinkering with it, you could log into other people's accounts. And this guy puts together a YouTube video, uploads it, and he's showing himself accessing other people's accounts, but he's doing this and recording in this video like all of their personally identifiable information, and it's a very unprofessional way to do disclosure, to show off you accessing someone else's information in your in your report and then publishing it out in the open as opposed to sending it to the company in a responsible manner. This is something you should avoid doing. And finally, there's always going to be, when in any form of disclosure, vendor negligence, and this is something that may change in the future. But to relate it to existing laws for violent crime or outside of cyberspace, rather, if two people are in the room and person A sees person B is dying and can help or is controlling what they need to survive and refuses to help, that is a case of potentially negligent homicide. Unfortunately, there's no equivalent in cyberspace. If you disclose a bug that, say, affects X% of their products and can lead to customers getting their identities stolen, lives ruined, etc., and they refuse to patch it. They just do not acknowledge it. They refuse to patch it for months, maybe years, and it eventually gets exploited. Should there be some form of negligence there? Negligent robbery, negligent identity theft, negligent abuse of computer systems? Maybe sometime in the future we'll have some form of recourse for the victims of these crimes on the vendor side, and at least in these terms. But enough about disclosure already. We have topics to get into, like the basics of penetration testing and hacking. So, there's a cyclical life cycle that usually is used to describe most forms of penetration testing, and it repeats once you get to the end of it. Step 1 is reconnaissance, information gathering, surveillance, and intelligence gathering. Step 2 is scanning for targets and weaknesses and enumerating the network topology and other assets and other attack vectors. Step 3 is exploiting one of those attack vectors and vulnerabilities in them and gaining access to a target system. Step 4 is once you've gained access, to escalate privileges, either by credential reuse or further exploitation of vulnerabilities or improperly configured security mechanisms. Maintaining access is step 5, and you could group rootkits and other persistent malware in that category. And finally, step 6 involves covering tracks, and that involves erasing logs and other records of your intrusion. And again, prior to a penetration test, the most important thing is to get permission. And so in getting permission, a discussion with the client establishes the scope of the penetration test and what is allowed and what is permitted. So you'll discuss what type of pen test you'll be giving, whether physical access is allowed, whether social engineering is allowed, or it's going to be covert or overt. If it's overt, the security team will know you guys are coming during a fixed time, which rigs the results, to be honest. Social engineering is something that is it has mixed results. It's extremely effective. The bad guys use it. However, when you use it in a pen test and you put in a report that Mary Ann so-and-so complied with my social engineering request and gave me credentials or this or that, told me what I needed to know, and then I compromised your system thanks to her. Some bosses may just go on and fire that employee. That's the incorrect response in most cases. Granted, there are employees that are problem ones, and if they need to be weeded out, then that's fine, but that's not the issue. The majority of the time, however, bosses follow up wrong and just take it out on the employee instead of implementing some form of site-wide policy or email about this issue. Secondly, you'll establish the rules of engagement. You'll establish what is off limits. the threat model, what you're trying to research for them, whether it's an insider threat, an ex-employee with some amount of information, or outsider altogether that is attacking the system blind, and you'll establish what targets you would uh, they would like you to go after, like the database or etc. And then you'll establish a timeline and what you'll be giving to them in a report. So for step one, reconnaissance, it's mostly internet and web searches, and you can find devices and access points perhaps based on the company's banners, if they have any, down at the service level. The company website is a good place for reconnaissance, especially, however, the cached versions on the Wayback Machine and other archive sites. Public records and social media are a good place for recon. But if social engineering is allowed, easy mode is on. You can make phone calls to all the different departments of the company, and usually you can find weak links in the staff. Good candidates usually are sales, any PR people. IT is hard because they're usually aware of people trying to social engineer them. But you can always call and say you're an employee, you forgot this and that. So there are ways to get around it. If they're smart, they're going to ask you to identify yourself. And it's even better if you're allowed to visit in person. And again, the purpose of all of this is solely for intelligence gathering, trying to gather as much information about the target, its assets, its services, and if you're good, what versions of software they're running. That way you can make a better plan of attack for the penetration test. And open source intelligence, OSINT, is essentially looking at all the company website records, Google records, any public financial records, especially if there's any upcoming mergers. You can call and impersonate the IT staff on the other side and social engineer a lot of information out of the target. DNS records are another good avenue for looking if they've misconfigured something or what they're actually exposing to the internet that you may not see on your scans. Social media and employee blogs are also good. You can generally infer what software they're running by looking at the LinkedIn and job hunting profiles for any of the employees. Like LinkedIn, they'll say, I'm good with Linux, Solaris, and etc. And if everyone currently working there has something in common, it's quite likely that they have that in their systems. Say Windows administration, Linux administration, etc. Now, human intelligence is again social engineering. It's already been explained. There's a good site called the penteststandard.org. It's not a legal standard in the sense, but it is a very well put together resource. It's a work in progress, I'll admit, on standards to follow for each one of these phases, and they have standards to follow for intelligence gathering, and it's worth checking out. Next step is, once you've done intelligence gathering, is to scan and enumerate. This involves determining what applications and operating systems are up and running, at least for the ones that you can connect to on the network, what versions of software they are running, and discovering what accounts may be on them and how to access their applications. There are tons of tools that are out there for automating this, and we're not going to go over most of them, as this is a tool agnostic class teaching the underlying fundamentals you need to know. Once you have the fundamentals under your belt, all of these tools are trivial to use, and also you can go beyond the tools when the tools fail, which is really important. The next step is identifying the attack surface, and this depends on the business and the target, and its day-to-day operations and what its purpose is. It obviously a power company is going to have critical infrastructure and SCADA and embedded systems, whereas an insurance company is not, and they're going to have a lot of databases. And so that attack surface is uh, going to be unique, usually per industry. And so for a single system, outside of that argument, just for a single desktop system, it would be all the ports that are running and open, all the user counts and the strengths of the passwords, the file system permissions model, all available programs, and anything excluding physical access, effectively, any way to access it remotely. Finally, discovering vulnerabilities. If it's a website and it uses a content management system, it may be a vulnerable version, or it may be using a plugin, and the majority of CMS plugins do not get patched. In fact, the majority never get patched. And so that may be a way in. Perhaps there's old network services in use, or there's default credentials working, which is very common in critical infrastructure, unfortunately, and industries. Um, when you use this in a penetration test to then gain access to the target system, and there are multiple ways to do it. The least sophisticated is brute force of the password. There's web hacking, network hacking, exploit development, malware and phishing campaigns, which is unfortunately incredibly effective. And we'll talk about that later. Social engineering, as we've already discussed, and etc. Some of the most common ways that attackers and bad guys get into businesses is through social engineering. It is indeed the easiest way by far, and that encompasses phishing malware and spear phishing attacks. It's probably the second most is web application exploitation, with command injection like SQL injection, and also there's cross-site scripting to steal employee credentials, um, and also there's network exploitation, and a rising star in this category is pivoting from a third-party partner system. That is how essentially the Target hack happened, that leaked thousands, if not millions, of customer records, including credit cards and debit cards, etc. And they came in through actually a third party. The air conditioning units, the HVAC units, were maintained by a contractor to Target. And the contractor had just set default passwords on all of their smart HVAC units. And so the attackers broke into the contractor's database, found these credentials, then used them to log into the HVAC units, and then were inside Target's network. For whatever reason, that was not firewalled or segmented off. And from there, they simply pivoted into the network and got into the databases, and at each store were able to attack the payment terminal systems, and that's how they got away with so much information. And so, yeah, pivoting from a third-party system is a huge increasing problem, as well as pivoting from people's personal devices, wherever bring your own device is allowed. That's a huge problem. There's also malicious USBs and gift gaming keyboards, and a lot of other creative ways that people break into businesses by hacking. And once an attacker has hacked a system, they typically like to maintain access and also get more privileges and more power on the system. And so step 4 is typically privilege escalation. And attackers typically want root. And so they'll employ various tactics like exploiting vulnerable programs that run as root, which is SUID programs for Linux, trying to escape any sandboxes or virtual machines, trying to do key logging, trying to do more social engineering, like forwarding malicious attachments to coworkers, cracking any passwords and reusing them at other prompts or on other systems across the network, and etc. And once that is done, The fifth step is maintaining access and also extra post-exploitation. So once they get root on the system, they want to establish backdoors, they want to install a rootkit, they want to go after logs and erase them and steal any money and pivot into third-party systems, crack more passwords, expand control, go after all the loot, essentially money, data, intellectual property, and etc. What we're going to cover in this class is all the techniques you need to know to understand this life cycle, how hackers do it, and what you need to do to be able to prevent it at each step. From the development of applications to the running of them, the maintenance, and the system administration of them. It also encompasses the following topics: reverse engineering, exploit development, so shellcode through ROP, network hacking, web application hacking, social engineering, some post-exploitation techniques, physical security, a Metasploit we've taken out of the curriculum, and finally, one of the most important things you will learn is how to communicate system vulnerabilities so that they can get fixed. Perhaps the majority of vulnerabilities disclosed in penetration test reports do not end up getting fixed, and that's for a variety of reasons. Typically, it's because people are bad about security and see mandated penetration tests as an inconvenience, but they just have to get the box checked, and there's no legal requirement for them to follow up on the pen tester's advice. Hopefully, that changes one day, and it'll be a change for the better. But if the pen test report is bad because the hacker could not communicate any of the vulnerabilities, it is effectively worthless, and the hacker could be considered worthless as well. So, when doing a pen test, it's important to behave in a profile of behavior or threat category that the customer is looking for. They're interested in perhaps activism or hacktivists, or they're a defense contractor and they're interested in nation states attacking them. And so there are varying levels of sophistication here. This is a diagram from Wikipedia. I believe it's the page on advanced persistent threats, showing a similar life cycle for research, exploitation, privilege escalation, expanding access, exfiltrating data, covering tracks. It just has more steps. It's a bit more thorough. But in these inner rings, it has text labeling how each of these steps apply to given threat profiles, ranging from hacktivists to advanced persistent threats to commodity threats. And so advanced persistent threats would be capable and driven to do each one of these steps, and these steps are sometimes things that hacktivists are unable to do, like research the target and build their own ODAs and stuff like that, and so on. So this is something that'll come up throughout the class. It's a good diagram, and ultimately comes back to risk assessment, because knowing the profile of the threats that an organization faces is important, but also understanding the vulnerabilities. So pen testing and bug hunting and vulnerability research, these are all about finding the vulnerabilities in a system, and threat intelligence is really about and situational awareness and proper system administration and defenses help you gauge the threats that are currently acting on the vulnerabilities in your system, and allows you to then approximate the risk given the threat model and the vulnerabilities found by pen testers. Well, pen testers, red teamers, and etc., they could be internal security professionals. In the real world, however, pen testers aren't allowed to break laws in assessments and deployments, whereas bad guys, they can kidnap people, they can torture them, they can beat them up, they can blackmail them, they can extort them, they can use all of this to gain insider credentials to your systems to accomplish a variety of goals. They can also buy crime kits. They can buy identities online and use them to impersonate people. They can impersonate police with fake uniforms and many other things, which is why pen testing is actually so important, is to do properly, not just run some script kiddie utility. Um, and this is also why the social engineering aspect is extremely important too for some organizations. It's underappreciated in my opinion. Yep. So, getting back to the cost of reactive security, if each one of these database records costs $140, we'd be looking at $140 billion per year in just records leaked. That's only, where is it? Obtained information. It's only 26% of this pie. It's a huge cost. So can't we just fix all of this by using safer code and better security tools and everyone being smart and getting rid of the dumb users and having strong passwords and keeping everything patched? The answer is unfortunately no. Um, and at the end of the class, you will realize why. That is it for today's lecture. I hope you enjoy the rest of the class. It's a very exciting course that tens of thousands of people have used, and the reading for today, if you'd like to do it, is in the Hacking Art of Exploitation book in section 2, or OX 200 through 260. And the sources for today are the history slides about the disclosure debate and the history before it came from Dan Guido's vulnerability disclosure, penetration testing, and vulnerability analysis lecture from his fall 2011 course that is hosted at pentest.cryptocity.net, or at least it was, if it's not anymore. And then all of the infographics and charts came from IBM X-Force Research. They do really good research. Most of it is really spot on and provides awesome introspection on trends of attackers and defenders, as well as industry for patching. And that is it. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoy.